Hello, and thank you all for being here. So just a quick reminder that this study day will continue tomorrow at a different location. We will meet at 9:30 at Amphi Buffon, which is located on the Université Paris Diderot campus. So make sure to come there, not here. Another quick note, after this keynote, we'll have a reception downstairs in the Salle Warburg. So it's downstairs. Please join us. And right now we will start with a few welcome remarks. And I would like to thank Diego Candil, the director of the Terra Foundation for American Art Europe, Ségolène Leman, the president of the Fondation de l'Université Paris Nanterre, and Mark Meggs, professor of American history at the Université Paris Diderot, for agreeing to say a couple of words to open the study day. So please join me in welcoming Diego.
Well, thank you, Tatiana. I think we owe a lot to you for this study day. Let me just say a few words before really talking about this event. You may know or may heard that the Terra Foundation began its teaching programs here in Europe in 2009. So it's like long term now, I would say. And we could do that, particularly here in France, thanks to François Brunet. On the idea and proposal of Verle Tillmans, who recently left the Terra Foundation to begin to work here at the INHA, we decided to dedicate every year study day to the memory of François Brunet. I must admit that I knew him. I met him for the first time, I think it was in the 2000s year. I'm one among the team of the Terra Foundation who really collaborated with him. I would say that for me, he was really an important advisor. I left the Terra Foundation for 10 years for other missions outside. And when I joined back the Terra Foundation's team last year, he was one of the persons I wanted to meet because I knew he was honest enough to tell me his thoughts about our research and university programs. We have done many things with him. An exhibition, a beautiful one, in Giverny in 2007. He was part of the Terra Summer Residency. So it's a very, very long-term relation, and I must admit that we all felt a bit lonely when we heard about his departure. Let me warmly thank you, Madame Brunet. I know I have your official name, and I'm sorry. I would like to be polite, Madame Lily Parrot Brunet. Really thank you, and I can tell you how important he was for all of us. But of course, we want to keep him alive through this idea of the study day. So thank you, Tatiana, again, for organizing it. Thank you, Mark, for being the new advisor of Tatiana for this study day. Thank you, Aurélie, also, for being part of that. And of course, thank you to all the different participants, Madame Whiting here. Thank you for being here. It is very important for us to bring American art in European audiences. It is important to bring American art among more general art history. This study day is part of this ambitious program we're having here in Europe. So thank you for being here. Monsieur Meggs, please. No? Oh, Ségolène, I'm sorry. Madame Leman.
I don't know. Thank you. Je vais parler en français parce que c'est ce qui était proposé, mais effectivement, Tatiana m'avait demandé de rappeler un petit peu le contexte de ce programme, qui est un programme auquel nous tenons beaucoup, que nous devons à la Fondation Terra, mais aussi en effet au partenariat mené avec François Brunet, auquel a participé aussi notre collègue qui certainement pense à nous aujourd'hui, qui est Christian Joschke, qui se trouve aux États-Unis aujourd'hui, mais qui a vraiment beaucoup travaillé avec François dans le cadre de ses recherches sur la photographie, et nous avons été absolument bouleversés quand nous avons appris en effet sa disparition brutale. En ce qui me concerne, c'est Christian justement qui m'a adressé un email pour m'en prévenir. C'est un collègue dont nous avions beaucoup apprécié la collégialité, la générosité, l'intelligence, l'attitude à l'égard des étudiants très ouverte, et puis la façon dont nous pouvions mener en commun ce programme. Et en effet, il avait même voulu absolument que dans ce programme, qui est un programme original dans la mesure où la Fondation Terra nous finance très généreusement la présence de Tatiana pendant 2 ans, et ce programme va être ensuite reconduit pendant encore 2 ans, une paire d'années à nouveau. La contrepartie des universités, c'était de proposer l'invitation de professeurs étrangers, et Professor Whiting is one of the first of them. Et donc François avait généreusement proposé justement de prendre la responsabilité de l'invitation de cette première année. L'idée étant qu'au cours du premier semestre, Tatiana présente un séminaire aux étudiants des 2 universités, donc c'est très fructueux puisque ça associe à la fois des historiens de l'art et des américanistes. Et puis au second semestre, Tatiana a la charge lourde d'organiser ces journées d'études. Je dois dire qu'elle s'en est admirablement occupée, que tout a été organisé très bien. On est heureux aussi de voir dans ce programme demain intervenir Angela Miller, qui a été un de nos professeurs invités dans les années antérieures. Et donc, voilà, merci Tatiana. Je vais m'arrêter là parce que l'essentiel, c'est d'entendre la conférence de Professor Whiting.
It's my pleasure to introduce Sessile Whiting, whose communication is entitled The Panorama and the Global Expanding the American Landscape in World War II, in a conference called Global Currents, Local Tides in the 1940s, and I'm looking for my cultural anchor or buoy as we get from World War II to the Cold War in a fraught decade. And her work is concentrated on the connections between art and politics, art and the visual culture, art and urban cultures, making connections that someone like me, an historian and part of an Anglophone studies department, looks for to navigate successfully. Sessile Whiting is Chancellor's Professor in the Department of Art History and the Graduate Program in Visual Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She specializes in the history of American art, especially of the mid-20th century, about which she has published 3 books: Anti-Fascism in America, in American Art, which Yale, 1989, A Taste for Pop Art, Gender and Consumer Culture, Cambridge, 1997, and Pop LA, Art in the 1960s, University of California, 2006. Pop LA was awarded the 2009 Charles C. Eldridge Prize from the Smithsonian Institute of Distinguished Scholarship in American Art. I haven't got time to do more than mention her many articles on related subjects with their provocative titles. This semester, she is visiting professor at, as Ségolène explained, and it's a complex and difficult arrangement, but it has been very successful. And next year, it continues with an invitation to Nanterre. The several programs and exchanges that the Terra Foundation has created with us at Paris Diderot have been an inestimable addition to what we do there and to what our students can do, so thank you, Terra Foundation. And we have been part of the astonishing impact the Terra Foundation has had on the scholarship of American art since the Foundation's inception. The connection between the Foundation and Paris Diderot is largely the work of François Brunet, who worked, as you understand by now, who worked tirelessly on these programs and protocols, and who taught so many of our students preparing their way towards research, teaching as tactics, fellowships, as strategy, thinking ahead, if you like, and that's François. So thank you, François. François, in fact, supplied me with the names of your published articles today, Sessile. I typed your name into my computer looking for your address, and the first thing to appear was a communication from François telling me everything about you. And it was from a year ago. And in it, he says that you are important to us because of a conference we are to be organizing, not this one, but one that will in fact take place in 2020. What better testimony to his ongoing influence and far-seeing organization? Sometime soon, Sessile, I will be speaking to you about this project, fulfilling paths and plans laid down by François. Who knows how far those paths will take us, but I am sure the direction is good. That is, however, for later, and now, panorama and the global. There.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that very generous introduction, and I am really grateful to the Terra and to Tatiana, but mostly to François Brunet, because he is the one who first contacted me about coming to Paris Diderot and being in residence here. I had met him a number of years ago in the United States because we were both on the editorial board for the journal American Art, and he just swooped into the room and impressed us all with his brilliant insights and generosity, and of course I'm very sorry that he's not here with us today. During World War II, maps that pictured troops advancing and retreating across national borders, along with photographs and newsreels documenting death and destruction in theaters of war around the world, prompted a change in painted representations of landscape in the United States. American artists recast the terms of landscape painting as it had been practiced in the 1930s, broadening its scope from the local to the international and from the pastoral to the anti-pastoral. Artists rethought landscape painting in two significant ways in an effort to reach beyond national borders and incorporate the national scene, international scene. First, paintings by Thomas Hart Benton and John Stuart Curry adopted a panoramic mode, literally and metaphorically widening the horizontal scope of their paintings to encompass both the United States and Europe. Second, in the painting The Rock, Peter Bloom attempted to fit the globe into his landscape. With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, many artists who had previously turned a blind eye to political events in Europe and Asia took up their paintbrushes as weapons, either enlisting as visual war correspondents, crafting ferocious propaganda for the government, or joining nonprofit organizations such as Artists for Victory. For many such artists, participating directly in wartime artistic production meant redefining their practice by adopting radical new subject matter. On occasion, they traveled far from home. In 1943, Francis Henry Taylor, the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, characterized the change in blunt terms. He said, "Whatever his previous preoccupation with 3 plums in a silver dish, the artist has now been wrenched out of it by the necessity of recording under every imaginable human stress and terror man's reaction to the greatest crisis of all history." Among those artists who stayed in the United States, the regionalist artists, Thomas Hart Benton, John Stuart Curry, and Grant Wood, were perhaps the most striking example of artists who changed course because of the war. Famous in the 1930s for being isolationists and rejecting international currents, both artistically and politically, they tried in the 1940s to find ways to address current events. Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the regionalist artists had begun to feel the pressure of World War II. Writing in his memoirs many years later, Benton indicated that he had become increasingly worried about the threat of fascism before the United States entered the conflict. Believing that the country was approaching war, he felt unable to devise an appropriate artistic response. He stopped painting altogether and departed instead on a lecture tour. Wood's anxiety led him in September 1940 to try his hand at designing a propaganda poster for Bundles for Britain, a relief agency that shipped American clothing and medical supplies to England. Produced at the beginning of the Blitz, Wood's poster testified to his awareness of international events and his concern for the British suffering from German air raid bombings. The regionalist Midwest was nowhere to be seen in this poster, but this absence did little to alter Wood's reputation for isolationism. For instance, critic Peyton Boswell wrote in a review of the memorial show for Grant Wood at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1942, quote, "America has been forced by fascist enemies into an all-out war for the democratic way of living, and in that fight, most of us realize we are in a global struggle. Today, the United States is perhaps more international-minded than ever before. Grant Wood and all those associated with him in the long crusade for a genuine native expression in the arts are in eclipse." In fact, after Pearl Harbor, Benton and Curry, Wood died just 2 months after the attack, attempted to produce a regionalist-style artwork focused on the Midwestern landscape, but in a manner now redolent with international significance. To say that Benton's and Curry's sensibility became international does not mean that they abandoned their regionalist roots, nor does it imply that they suddenly became distressed about the fate of France or England. Their primary concern in these paintings remained the heartland of the United States. Yet Curry and Benton recognized in these works that the Midwest was not entirely isolated from Europe and the Pacific. It too had a place within a global context. Both Curry and Benton adopted panoramic vision to implicate the heartland in international events. Curry's The Light of the World appeared in color in Esquire magazine just days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Characterized by the magazine as the personification of this moment of our world in storm, the grand horizontal sweep of the canvas splits down the middle, encompassing the local on the left and the international on the right. With church, red barn, and farmhouse joined with skyscrapers, Curry conflates the Midwest with the New York City and has farmers, women, and children huddled together with businessmen in the harbor watching a storm brewing across the ocean, presumably the war in Europe. Stretching the landscape horizontally as if the actual physical size of the canvas had to project the distance between the eastern seaboard of the United States and the impending European storm, Curry exceeded both the borders of the nation and of the magazine. This painting was reproduced as a paper fold-out that stretched 18 inches, twice as wide as the magazine itself. Curry had originally titled his painting a bit more ominously than the editors at Esquire, calling it America Facing the Storm. In the painting for Esquire, he turned then a natural phenomenon into an allegory for its social and political upheaval. In this manner, he adopted a strategy that had been used in American landscape painting since at least the Civil War. For instance, when Frederick Church exhibited his dramatic Cotopaxi in New York in March of 1863, critics saw in the volcanic explosion and torrents of smoke a reference not only to the volcano in Ecuador, but also to war clouds, presumably of the American Civil War. Geological and meteorological effects, including most notably storms, chasms, and dead tree limbs, have long served as parables for death and destruction in landscape painting. Curry's use of a wide-angle perspective to include the United States and the world beyond it found its echo in Benton's The Year of Peril, a series of 8 paintings completed in 1942. Purportedly, when Benton heard the news about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he immediately stepped off the lecture podium in Cincinnati and went home to Kansas City to paint a comprehensive and blunt statement about the war. The series was first exhibited in New York City in April of 1942, and then Abbott Laboratories, which was a pharmaceutical company based in Chicago, published reproductions of the paintings in a booklet. You're seeing the cover of the booklet here, with an introduction by Archibald MacLeish, he was an important writer. He was then Librarian of Congress and head of the U.S. Office of Facts and Figures. Newspapers around the country publicized Benton's series, and Paramount Pictures featured it in a segment of its newsreel for the week of April 14th, 1942. Together, the paintings developed a narrative vividly presenting the gore and violence of war, the evil nature of the fascists, and in two of the paintings, the threat of fascism to a vulnerable and sleeping Midwest. Invasion, the second largest canvas in the series, depicts the heartland overrun by the invading enemy. In this painting, fascist soldiers trespass across a great slice of the country, from shining sea to amber waves of grain. Benton relies on a wide-angle perspective, reminiscent of Curry's The Light of the World, to capture a sweeping view of the United States. He combines the eastern seaboard and the Midwest, the city and the country. However, Benton replaces Curry's impending storm with actual ships arriving from Europe on the right. The invaders, personified as dark-skinned, faceless monsters, make their way through the city. It's New York, for we see the outline of the Empire State Building among the skyscrapers, and out across the countryside with their tanks. There, among the haystacks, farms, and green hills, enemy soldiers attack a rural family. Liquor bottle and weapons in hand, they destroy the land, rape a woman, mutilate children, and ram a bayonet down the throat of a farmer. In this picture, the war has moved from across the ocean in Europe and escalated into a full-scale invasion of the heartland. The fascist attack convulses the Midwestern landscape like the tornado in The Wizard of Oz that sweeps up Dorothy's farmhouse from its flat Kansas plain. The foreground in Benton's canvas tips up, catapulting all the figures across it in a diagonal. Benton combines the regional and the international in a stretch from background depth to foreground climax, where the agrarian ideal is upended literally and figuratively. Curry's and Benton's primary concern in these paintings remained the American Midwest. As these paintings expanded the limits of the landscape from the heartland to encompass the international, their wider perspective established a view from a place, from here in the Midwest, or here on the shores of the eastern seaboard, to over there. Intentionally or not, Curry's and Benton's scenes of impending invasion reversed the formula of panoramic pictures depicting westward expansion, popular in the mid and late 19th century. Emanuel Leutze, in Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, a mural of 1861, which is installed in the US Capitol building, has the viewer join pioneers poised on a cliff at the Continental Divide, looking west toward a San Francisco Bay bathed in golden light. They appear to gaze at what they consider to be their rightful destiny. The social and political implications of this westward momentum are made even more explicit in American Progress of 1872 by John Gast. In this painting, we float with an allegory of progress in the sky who lays a telegraph wire across the land while leading settlers from the east to west, displacing the buffalo and indigenous people in their path. Curry's and Benton's works invoke a tradition of the panoramic landscape that not only encompasses a broad geographic sweep, but also comes laden with particular narratives about American progress. Whether or not Curry and Benton were aware of these 19th century precedents, at least part of the rhetorical force of their paintings depends on these conventions. Rather than depicting the inhabitants of the New World as rightful colonizers moving westward, Benton and Curry have them as vulnerable citizens, looking at the force of evil arriving from across the Atlantic Ocean. The panoramas by Curry and Benton from World War II reversed the older visual chronicle of empire building to depict the enemy threatening the very ground of the nation. Yet, in their efforts to visualize the relationship between the United States and Europe across the sweep of the Atlantic Ocean, Benton's and Curry's paintings relied on the somewhat antiquated assumptions of the Mercator map, which for centuries had enabled travel by sea and land. Developed in the 16th century by a Flemish cartographer, the Mercator projection became the standard map for nautical navigation by the 18th century. However, the Mercator map's arrangement of longitude and latitude distorted both the distances between countries and the geographical scale of various land masses, particularly those closest to the two poles. Standard world maps available in the United States in the 1930s were, as scholar Alan Henriksen points out, quote, indebted to the Mercator projection and centered on the Greenwich meridian, dividing the Pacific Ocean into two parts, approximately along the international dateline, which put Hawaii on the left side of the map in the extreme west and placed Japan at the extreme right. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor shattered the geographical illusion embedded in conventional world maps of distance between Hawaii and Japan and of oceans as buffers between the United States and the battles in Asia and Europe. The well-known political geographer Hans Weigert opened his article, Maps Are Weapons, published in 1941, with a frank recognition of the way in which the war had altered geographical preconceptions. And I quote him, "In this country, the secure feeling of isolation, of being far away from war and danger, ruled only a few months ago. We all know how basically this conception of our geographic isolation and of security has been undermined and destroyed in the immediate past. National border lines disappear before the onslaught of a truly total war. If today a statesman would declare that America's frontiers may be on the Rhine, this would simply provide an illustration of the shrinking of the earth." In their paintings, Benton and Curry both acknowledged the new sense of vulnerability experienced by Americans, yet even so, both still conceived of the war from the perspective of someone standing on land, looking at a threat arriving in the form of a storm, or from ships traveling across the ocean. During World War II, cartographers stepped in to picture the new realities of space and time ushered in by what was then called Air Age geography. When in 1944, geographer Walter Ristow summarized the basic principles of the nascent practice, he began with the assertion that, quote, "Air Age geography is global geography," and went on to explain that, quote, "A worldwide war and long-range aircraft have finally brought general acceptance of the fundamental fact that we inhabit a globe." With ships and aircraft sweeping across natural and political barriers, new maps measure distances by minutes and not miles, while directional arrows and lines accentuated proximities, interconnections, and entanglements. Richard Eddys Harrison, who produced many striking maps for Fortune magazine, as well as several atlases during the war, was perhaps the most well-known and influential cartographer of the day. One of Harrison's most famous maps, One World, One War, from August 1941, orients the globe around the North Pole, thereby demonstrating how near the continental United States was to the land masses of Eurasia where war raged. As scholar Susan Schulten has pointed out, this particular map hung in many American homes and served as the frontispiece to a contemporary geography textbook. The notion of proximity conveyed in Harrison's maps was underscored in the opening text to A War Atlas for Americans, published in 1944. Quote, "No place on the globe is more than 60 hours flying time from any American city." Of course, 60 hours now, that time has shrunk much more. We have jets. With his map, Three Approaches to the United States, Harrison stressed that aerial proximity left every place in the United States vulnerable to attack, even such cities in the Midwest as Chicago and Detroit, visible from Berlin across the polar axis. Rather than anticipate an enemy attack from the point of view of an American victim standing firmly on the homeland, as had Benton and Curry, Harrison offered up the enemy's predatory view from its position as proximate aerial threat. An exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, Airways to Peace, which opened in August 1943, recognized the decisive shift in the geographical imagination ushered in by aerial warfare. Harrison was the chief consultant cartographer, while Wendell Willkie provided the political vision in the opening text of the catalog and in all but one of the panels for the 6 sections of the exhibition. Willkie, a one-time Republican candidate in 1940 for president, enjoyed widespread fame in 1943 because of the publication that year of his book entitled One World. Written after Willkie's 49-day trip in a 4-engine bomber around the world the previous year through South America, Africa, the Middle East, Russia, and China, the book sold over 3 million copies and was translated into many languages. Willkie, announcing, quote, "There are no distant points in the world any longer," end quote, anticipated a new era of unity at the end of the war that would transcend narrow nationalisms and draw together people of different races and ethnicities from around the globe. Echoing the ideas from One World, Willkie reiterated in Airways to Peace that the world in the age of flight was a small and interdependent sphere. During the war, the globe replaced the map as the preferred means of visualizing geography and defining proximity. The Airways to Peace exhibit, which began with a section devoted to the history of maps, juxtaposed a globe against a Mercator projection, warning that the latter generated dangerously misleading conceptions of distance that a globe could correct. In the largest room of the exhibition, an 11-foot round polar projection with demarcations of major air routes illustrated the new geographical orientation. As the catalog pronounced, "The course over the top of the world is now clearly the shortest and speediest way to friend and enemy alike." Globes miniaturize the world and invite viewers to spin them on axis in order to study land and sea from various angles. The most famous globe in this section of the exhibition was this enormous 50-inch diameter globe lent by President Roosevelt, which you're seeing here as it appeared in the Oval Office. And it went further in offering ever-changeable aerial perspectives. Prepared by the Map Division of the Office of Strategic Services and presented by the U.S. Army to the President, this globe was the largest of its kind and included more geographic details than most. It rested on a special steel base with rubber bearings, enabling it to be swiveled in any direction. The visitor to the exhibit was made to understand that the president, in manipulating the globe, adopted a variable perspective, viewing geographical relations from new and changing angles, all for the sake of fighting the war strategically. The featured display in the exhibition meant to exemplify air-age geography was a partial globe, 15 feet in diameter, with all bodies of water cut away from below the equator to allow visitors to step into the core of the planet to view geographic relations on its surface from the inside rather than from the outside. According to the curators, with this display, visitors could, quote, more readily see all the continents and their true relationship in one glance. Like Harrison's One World, One War map, this view brought attention to the fact that the most populous nations of the world are, quote, clustered about the North Pole within easy flying distance of one another. Globes, large and small, globes to be spun and to be entered, emphasized mobility and flexibility in viewing geographic relations from the air. Bloom's The Rock, a painting that preoccupied the artist for the duration of the war and beyond until he completed it in 1948, features a globe of sorts right in the middle of the landscape. This blasted rock, moss-covered on the outside, bloody red and fissured on the inside, sits on a brown slab. itself resting on a natural pedestal of dirt and slabs of stone. An animal skeleton, a flowering fungus, and dead tree stump and branch lie before the rock, while a young girl kneels below it with her arms upraised, grasping at dirt and a root. The broken sphere blocks our view down the center of the picture, contravening the conventions of Claudian landscape, in which a horizontal topographical feature, such as a river or path winding through the middle of the scene, leads the eye back into depth. Rather than creating a view of a typical landscape, Bloom focuses our attention on the large rock, which, if regarded in its spherical character as an allegory of the globe, has the effect of placing the entire world at the very center of a local setting. Is the rock indeed a miniature version of the earth scourged by war? In numerous interviews and letters, Bloom voiced variations of the following statement, quote, "Well, the bloody rock of course goes back to the world being shattered and smashed," end quote. The rock even bears an uncanny resemblance to the right side up version of the special outside-in globe from Airways to Peace, though Bloom invites the viewer to penetrate the globe in order to get up close to its guts, rather than to study the continents. The broken rock resonates with many a science fiction tale from World War II, in which the Earth, destroyed by war, is characterized as a terrible, gashed boulder, desolate and empty of life. For instance, Arthur Clarke's The Rescue Party of 1946 describes a ruined land, a waste of barren rock. In addition to playing the role of a ravaged planet Earth, Bloom's rock could also be interpreted as an agent of destruction, a meteor fallen to Earth. In the 1940s and early 50s, however, the real threat perceived to be potentially dropping from the sky was nuclear weapons, not rocks. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy made the association explicit when he portrayed a globe as an atom bomb hovering above an aerial view of a city grid in this painting of 1946. Or consider the 9-minute film, One World or None, produced 1 year after the end of World War II and based on a best-selling book of essays by the same title written by leading nuclear scientists. Here's the introduction, and unfortunately I don't think we're going to get the sound, but imagine lots of crashing sounds. Bloom's rock, understood as a miniature Earth, recognizes not only the shift in the geographical imagination from the Siemens map to air-age geography, but also the state of the world, broken apart by war and threatened by the bomb. Does the young woman kneeling below the rock worship a false god, a golden calf, or does she raise her arms in despair about the fate of the Earth? Her subordinate position, grasping at the dirt, craning her neck to see over the ledge above her, places her in a very different relationship to the Earth than, say, that of President Roosevelt, photographed with his 50-inch sphere. The president is seen leaning from his seat behind his desk in the Oval Office to peer at the continents of Europe and Africa. He exudes serious interest and command over the globe. Cementing a sense of the president's resolve, an American flag hovers behind the globe while a telephone sits on his desk ready to convey his orders. Where he looks over and commands, the young woman in Bloom's painting peers upward, desperate and unknowing. She lacks an understanding of the continents and displays no delight, as does this fresh-faced and smiling boy seen in the frontispiece to a geography textbook from 1944. This teen holds his Harrison map, One World, One War, open with the continents spread out before him, contained between his outstretched hands. In both of these photographs of the president and the boy, omniscient aerial vision promises understanding and command over global relations. In Bloom's painting, in contrast, the globe has burst apart, losing the wholeness and coherence of a globe viewed from above. The young woman below cannot see the rock in its entirety, let alone save it from its terrible fate. We, the viewers of the painting, fare better in our understanding of the rock, in a position similar to Roosevelt's or the boys with the atlas. We can see, in addition to destruction, evidence of renewal beyond the globe itself to which the young woman devotes her exclusive attention. Enormous bright red flowers sprout from the fungus and surround the dead tree limb adjacent to the animal's skeleton on the ledge upon which the rock rests, on the side away from the young woman. It is true that the scarlet fungus, mutant in size, could be understood as hinting at the possibility of a future gone awry in the manner of a science fiction tale of the day in which scant resources and monstrous births become the norm after the destruction of the earth. Yet, such an allusion to a dystopian outcome is contained within a narrative of reconstruction, whereby the right side of the picture depicts a red brick building in ruins, while the left side offers the promise of fresh reconstruction, both literal and figurative. The charred timber, still smoldering fire and billowing smoke engulfing the ruins of the red brick building were triggered for Bloom by photographs of houses bombed in the London Blitz. As Bloom explained in an interview, that was based on the Blitz period when London was being destroyed and the bombs kept shearing a house right down the middle and leaving everything there, the rocking chair and everything. Bloom had portrayed a blasted red brick building consumed by black smoke in the corner of a previous painting, Fracture Ward of 1944. Indeed, on numerous occasions, Bloom claimed that the broken building in Fracture Ward was also inspired by photographs of London in ruins. Fracture Ward depicts the new penicillin ward of an army hospital on Staten Island. Fittingly, the painting was commissioned by the pharmaceutical company Abbott Laboratories. The scene itself is reassuringly clean, even homey. Yet the image of the destroyed building in the lower left intrudes into this otherwise safe hospital ward, reminding us, like the broken rock in Bloom's later canvas, of a global war occurring elsewhere. Penicillin cannot protect these soldiers from the violence of combat, for their bodies are broken like the buildings, while the traction frames ambiguously anticipate both the fractured timbers at the right of the rock and the construction scaffolding at its left. The ruins in the rock assume a more prominent position than they did in the fracture ward, and no longer functioning as a picture within a picture, body forth as a real part of the landscape, here and now. With the fire still burning and the smoke billowing, the bombed building to the right testifies that needless destruction continues into the present. The building under construction to the left, with its distinctive chimney, evokes the modernist New World sensibility of Frank Lloyd Wright's house, Falling Water, which was a building certainly on the mind of the painter. In 1938, the owner of this iconic American building, Edgar Hoffman, commissioned Bloom to depict his newly completed home. Bloom quickly finished a 10 by 14-inch oil, but was stymied by the task of enlarging it to 5 by 7 feet. After a long, torturous struggle, Bloom gave up on this project in 1940, only to return to it nearly 2 decades later. In the meantime, this architectural project snuck its way into the rock. Fittingly, Kaufman purchased this painting, The Rock, settling for the image of his house under construction rather than a rendition of the completed house itself. Here, the modernist structure is the not yet realized antidote to the destruction of buildings that it mirrors across the dominant central rock. Its future completion promises a finished home built out of the remnants of war, a future new home, perhaps even a new world beyond the chaos of war. The bent and twisting bodies of the workers gathered toward the left side of the rock create a narrative arc of renewal, from the ruins in the right background looping beneath the blasted rock at the center to lead to the construction site in the left background. All of the figures in the scene are busy, ignoring the rock and the girl. The men and one small woman at the base of the construction site, white and black, striving together, recall the mixed race group in Fracture. A hope for peaceful coexistence between races echoes between these two paintings. The rock was first exhibited in 1949 at the Durlacher Gallery in New York, along with 97 preparatory drawings and a number of related paintings, one of which was Fracture Ward. Included as well were all 4 paintings completed immediately after a trip to Key West in 1940, where Bloom had retreated following the foundering of the Falling Water Project. Bloom acknowledged the relationship of one of these Key West paintings, The Buoy, to the rock in an undated letter to James Thrall Sobey, who was a curator at MoMA at the time. The artist honed in on a particular detail of the smaller painting. Quote, "The rough, encrusted sphere with sadistic lacerations of the buoy is broken apart in the rock. The broken sphere, the rock, is at once jagged stone and bleeding flesh." End quote. When he painted the buoy, Bloom decided to highlight one moment in a cycle of destruction and renewal of buoys he witnessed in Key West, the moment when they're pulled out of the ocean. They're covered with incrustations of various kinds at that point. They're scraped down and then repainted. Though fascinated with that entire life cycle, Bloom in the buoy obsessed over the object in its most battered state. He also made it monstrously large, indeed global, by dropping his point of view quite close to the ground. Time and again in interviews and in letters, Bloom associated the buoy he depicted with the global war, saying, for example, in one letter, "I saw the buoy as an image of the earth lacerated by the war." In the rock, Bloom took the deterioration of the buoy on its exterior one step further by shattering the sphere. However, he also pulled back from the prone position, that viewpoint is assigned to the young woman, and framed the broken, fissured rock as a world within a larger depiction of destruction and renewal. When the rock was exhibited, it received an enormous amount of positive press. Critics repeatedly acknowledged resonances between the painting and the current state of the world, while nonetheless finding in the painting a hopeful vision of the future. It was exhibited in 1949. It was shown the following year at the Carnegie International, where it was voted the best picture in the show by visitors. All of that coincided with a period of re-engagement by the United States in foreign affairs. At the war's end, isolationist sentiment had reemerged as the country focused its attention on the return of troops and the stabilization and growth of the domestic economy. However, the bleak state of Europe, especially after the harsh winter of 1946-47, lent a sense of urgency to talk in the United States about helping Europe. The Marshall Plan, proposed in 1947-48, marked a conscious effort by the United States government to intervene in world affairs and to help prepare Western European countries whose cities, transportation networks, and industries have been devastated and whose people have been killed and displaced by war. In Bloom's painting, the interlocking people of diverse races working together to create a new building, more broadly a new world, would seem to partake in the most idealistic sentiments about global engagement and future peace, expressed during the war and post-war period. In 1943, Wilkie had called for one world in which human conflict and inequality would be eliminated, both within the United States and beyond its borders. In a similar spirit, the United Nations was organized around lofty principles of peaceful coexistence and cooperation among member states. Patricia Clavin reports that, quote, "A peace built stone by stone" was the way the author of the Charter of the United Nations Organization described the task facing nations following the Second World War. Indeed, the emblem designed for the United Nations in 1945 shows a map centered on the North Pole, surely inspired by Harrison, contained by 5 concentric circles and 2 olive wreaths, reaching like arms to embrace a peaceful world. Bloom's vision of men and women of different races working together to build a house, stone by stone, gives visual form to the most hopeful and idealistic strains of post-war planning, even as it recalls the destruction of war only recently brought to an end. Yet Bloom's idealism also contains a nostalgic nod to the past with its celebration of manual labor, people working with their hands to hoist slabs and build a future home. The kind of collective labor pictured by Bloom harkens back to the 1930s, when leftist artists such as William Gropper could imagine brawny men of different races united in their efforts to realize a public work project. This painting, for example, features a racially integrated group of laborers mastering the machinery to build a dam. In Bloom's future world, manual labor even trumps modern commerce. Note the tin Coca-Cola sign among the debris on the right side of the painting. Although the Coca-Cola Corporation undertook its first efforts to establish itself in a global market in the 1920s, and during World War II shipped Coke to many a military base around the world, its global dominance would only emerge after the war. Something that Henry Luce's Time magazine celebrated with a cover in 1950 in which the globe, tucked in the arms of a Coke bottle cap, drinks a Coke out of the bottle. Global commerce was anticipated by the American business community long before the triumph of Coke, a vision that celebrated unity not through manual labor, but through an exchange of goods facilitated by telecommunication. Another Luce publication, the business magazine Fortune, forecast a world interconnected by technology and commerce even before the war ended. The cover of Fortune magazine from 1944, designed by Peter Peinig, accentuates a dense network connecting both sides of the globe. Inside the magazine, articles emphasize the need to plan for a future global economy by consolidating international communications and securing trade relations. In a similar spirit, a map designed by Harrison for IT&T, published in Fortune in September of 1945, highlighted the systems of communication controlled by IT&T, connecting San Francisco and New York to other hubs around the world. These are maps stressing proximity, not in order to point to America's vulnerability to the enemy, but instead to champion America's anticipated global economic dominance. Despite Bloom's nostalgic celebration of manual labor, his vision in The Rock also contains a note of American triumphalism. Implicit in Bloom's painting is a reassertion of the central place of the United States in the global arena, not as victim, but as victor, paving the way to the future. While the large bleeding rock fills the center of the landscape and blocks an imaginary trajectory into depth, the framing device of the buildings on either side of the rock still conform to the Claudian conventions and serve to define a panorama viewed from a place. To the extent that the red brick building in ruins on the right and the rock evokes the London Blitz, and the modern building under construction on the left recalls falling water, the narrative arc of the workers moves from the old world to the new. Ultimately, in this painting, the United States contains and rebuilds the world. Once the United States entered the war, American newspapers and magazines were filled both with maps tracking the progress of enemies across national borders and with photographs of distant lands where battles were being fought. The key role played by aircraft in fighting this war also altered the geographic imagination. Globes and maps produced in the United States during this period emphasized the proximity of continents in an interconnected world. Erasing a sense of geographic isolation of the United States raised the fear of its vulnerability to attack. In both Benton's and Bloom's paintings, we stand somewhat removed, observing violent disruptions of a panoramic landscape. Benton's setting is identifiably the United States, centered in the Middle West and spreading out laterally towards the eastern seaboard, where the enemy lands before making his way from the periphery to ravage the heartland. Bloom, instead, drops the disruption of global warfare into the heart of the local, fixing our attention on the central rock, the framing structures, and the foreground figures engaged in cleaning up and building anew. Completed at different moments of the war, the stories performed by the figures populating Benton's and Bloom's landscapes imply different outcomes to violent upheaval. Painted in response to Pearl Harbor, invasion serves as a shrill warning. The enemy lurks on our doorstep, poised to wreak death and destruction. completed after hostilities ceased, the figures in Bloom's The Rock seem to offer a more hopeful message about peoples and nations cooperating to reconstruct a broken world. Thank you.
This wonderful presentation. So if we can have a discussion now, I think that would be wonderful. If anyone has a question, if you could raise your hand so I can give you a mic, that would be lovely.
Okay, Mark, go ahead.
But I'll limit myself to one, which is about possible ironies in those paintings, and I'll point to the one of The Rock.
Yeah.
The workers building the future. You talk about them as harkening back to handcrafts and so on.
Manual labor. Yeah.
Manual labor, but they look a little crazy. The one, the blue-eyed one with the white T-shirt,
right,
is staring maybe at the girl. I'm not sure, but he looks a little nuts. And these guys are not going to build that building. It seems evident. They're in bare feet. You can't work with stones in bare feet. So they're ill-equipped. So that seems a little strange to me. Maybe it's nostalgia or something, but
no,
the future doesn't seem very certain.
Right. Yeah. No, but they are incredibly weird figures. They kind of are these elongated, rubbery figures.
Well, they're not. They haven't got the strength. They
right, and you're right that the one looks bug-eyed, and it's certainly an idealization that these barefoot men could build this building, and so I have kind of understood that. I guess irony would be a good way to think about it. I've understood it as both this vision of cooperative work together in the tradition of the 30s, but also this kind of surreal questioning of that vision of optimism and whether that's actually going to happen.
Well, the chimney has gone up, and
yeah.
I don't know why.
Well, there's that thing that hoists it up, a pulley. Yeah.
And then in the other one, in this one, I'm about to have the invasion, the Year of the Peril. It disturbs me that they're dark-skinned, and one of them looks as though he might have curly hair, and they might be Japanese. There's one with funny teeth, which was a stereotype image. And if that's the case, then the ocean is on the wrong side.
Right. Yeah.
And the uniforms are not German. And I don't know. They look, in fact, American.
Right. Somebody else has told me that those helmets are American helmets.
Well, the helmets and the gaiters, and so are the. One of the things that happens when you have a war is that you release all sorts of social energy and for good and bad in your own country. So that's the irony I would wonder about there.
Yeah. No, I think if you look at this, I didn't show you the whole series of 8 pictures, but he definitely relies on kind of racist stereotypes to caricature the 3 figures that represent Italy, Germany, and Japan. And he certainly, there were widespread racist caricatures, especially of the Japanese, that had begun with the so-called Yellow Peril in the 19th and into the 20th century. Yes, exactly, kind of play on that. And he's really relying on also kind of racist stereotypes of African Americans to represent the Germans in this series. So that goes to your point about maybe this is also about anxieties, internal social anxieties and energies.
There you can read World War I soldiers returning from Germany who are part of the effort to suppress race riots in Washington, D.C. right after, and they'll say, well, we're killing the German menace, and now we're killing this other racial horror here, and it's all good.
Which is, I think, why also Bloom is an interesting counterpoint, because his pictures do tend to include, you know, in a leftist tradition with which he was affiliated in the 1930s, this kind of ideal of races interacting with one another, which Benton was I mean, he did represent African Americans in the 30s, and he's criticized already by 1935 for relying on racist caricature in his images of African Americans, you know, banjo picking and so forth. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Any? Okay. Thank you. I just have two questions that came to my mind. Maybe the first one is really, I don't know, having Svetlana Alpers in mind or something, and the idea of a cartographic imagination. But I was just curious if there were any kinds of collaborations between artists and people making maps at the time, and if it was something that existed. And my other question is that the end of your talk really drives us towards this idea of a global village in the 1960s, and I'm curious whether you find a continuity in this again, this way of mapping a globe that connects the world together, also in terms of technology and bringing people very close, and so if you find a continuity throughout the 60s, or if it's still another step.
Okay, yeah. So thank you, Sophie, for those two good questions. And to the first point, there are. You know, Harris had really dominated the map making, and he comes out of a cartographic tradition, but somebody like Ralston Crawford, I don't know if you know his work, but he's an abstract artist, and he was hired by the US government to make maps that traced airways, and they were basically weather maps, and so he developed a whole graphic system for weather maps, and those are published in Fortune magazine. He then does images, you know, arguably shaped somewhat by those weather maps, and he of the Bikini Atoll tests, and also these were reproduced in Fortune magazine. So you can find some instances of that kind of collaboration. As to Bloom's vision of an interconnected global world, I think that among his artists, realist artists, kind of magic realist artists, I think there are efforts in the 50s of those artists to kind of think about how to be part of a community. Somebody like Ben Shahn, for example. But those are under the radar of most of the galleries in the 1950s, which are showing, you know, abstract expressionism, certainly, so I don't know that I would trace any kind of continuity then to the 1960s as a result. And I think that once the emergence of kind of identity politics in the late 60s, the vision of community that's put forth by people like Bloom or Shahn or so forth is put into question. Because there's always, you know, how do you represent people, different peoples, ethnicities, races, nations, without falling into stereotype. And I think that's a question that people like Bloom and Sean are wrestling with and having a hard time resolving. So, yeah.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Sessile. That was a great paper. I think this is probably just to try to pick up the first question, because when you were talking, I kept thinking of questions that were about the relationship between the works that you were showing, including these two, and the great 19th century landscape tradition. And every time I thought of a question, you answered it in the paper, which is a sign of a good paper, of course. But I do have one observation, at least, or set of questions around this, and it's to do with the rock, really.
Okay.
So one of the things that occurs to me might be happening here is that there is the point of reference here, if it has one, to that landscape tradition, seems to be to the heart of the Andes, right?
Okay.
Just compositionally, and in a number of ways, the church, literally the church in the heart of the Andes, is sort of reminiscent of the broken building on the right-hand side of this picture. But if it is the heart of the Andes, then in fact the heart of the Andes has been shrunk here into the jagged central element in this egg-like broken globe. And as it shrinks, it becomes sort of virulent, hellish red, and it becomes pernicious in some sense. So the aspirations that are coded into the heart of the Andes are shrunk here and then become questionable somehow. But it's also noticeable that the falling water picture is so dependent on that Claudian composition, actually, that you showed us.
Oh,
you know,
the
little sketch.
Yeah.
That's what it is, or the small version is so dependent on that.
Right.
And I suppose the question there, in the context of your positive reading of the bloom against what one might say about a negative reading, is that the falling water building under construction will have another view that at the moment is obscured. That isn't a question, I'm aware of that.
Good.
But it's a sort of set of observations about the way in which this picture works in relation to its positive and negative
well, I really like
implications.
the comment you made about the heart of the Andes sort of contained within the guts of the rock, and that turns it into a malicious figure. And it makes me think of the fact that the first book on landscape painting is published in the United States right after the war by this Wolfgang Born person. And he is very critical of the sort of church tradition as being too theatrical and so on. And so one could perhaps see this as also a kind of critique of a kind of landscape painting. And, you know, one could also point out that we have architecture in a way, we have sculpture because that rock's on pedestal, and then we have painting and these different disciplines that are also at war with each other, or perhaps trying to find ways to work together, which will be a challenge in the post-war period. So I thought those are very helpful.
Thank you for your talk. I had a similar question actually about the dead tree trunk, which, if I'm not mistaken, is also a feature of the 19th century traditional landscape painting in church and coal. So I was wondering what you were doing with it, and if it could be, maybe I'm going too far, but seen as a phallic symbol of some sort.
Well,
sorry.
point. I can't believe I never noticed that.
It's the fungus
sort of
and
sticking right out there, isn't
red
it?
and but then I don't know what to make of it. So there was.
Well, you know, I guess one could push the sort of something about the gender issues and the broken womb.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, thinking of if you think of the 1939 World's Fair, the symbol, the center of the fair, is the trilon and the perisphere, and it's this kind of womb-like round world, and inside of it is this model called democracy, you know, this kind of idealized garden city, which you could say that womb-like shape is broken apart here, and there's some sort of, maybe one could push that. I like that. And it's certainly, again, typically, of course, the broken limb in the 19th century landscape tradition is about the seasonal changes, the dead of winter, you know, or it can have allegorical meanings.
Like a threat to America.
Right.
Oh,
yeah, exactly. And so that's good. I like that.
The tree that also after the Civil War sometimes becomes, right, a sign of the mowing down of the dead.
Right, and there was a good article actually in that journal, American Art, about landscape photography after the Civil War, where you have a lot of dead tree limbs that serve as a metaphor for that. Yeah.
I just had a question about, was it Curry, the painting that then folds out from Esquire, which is so dramatic in itself, right, where people could open that and fold it out. So I completely love your idea of all of this bringing the war to the Midwest, and I agree with you that is looking at the storm in Europe. But having grown up in the Midwest, you know, my first reaction is that's the Great Lakes. That across the Great Lakes is Canada, and Canada is not a threat during World War II. So I kept trying to play with this in my mind. I'm like, well, it looks like Chicago. So then across the Great Lakes is actually more United States. I don't know. I was just trying to play, and I didn't know if there's anything. I guess I just don't know at that moment what the threat. So I guess they just by folding it out would have understood that it is further. So it's more of a comment, I guess, and maybe just wondering how you.
Right. Well, in a way, that's that whole thing about, you know, where's the threat coming from? What's the body of water? Is it the Pacific? Is it the Atlantic? I don't know about Canada. I mean, today we do think about the borders, but the more immediate borders. But I do think, of course, at that moment in time, people anticipated the U.S. was probably going to enter World War II, and there had been Roosevelt and his cabinet, which were pro-interventionists, were anticipating once England was bombed to move in that direction. So I think that Curry's picture really probably does relate to that war, that larger global war that's happening across. But
well, I don't know if it's a question, but one of the things that I was wondering that really came through for me in your presentation is the difference between international and global. And that seems to be, even between the two pictures, these two paintings between 1942 and 1948, that seems to be at stake, is this difference between international and global. And I was wondering, you kind of started talking about it a little bit in response to Sophie's question, but I was wondering if you might have thoughts about it, because it does seem that this kind of one world globular really subsumes the idea of the international, and in a way lays ground for the narrative of the Cold War. So I don't know if you might have thoughts about that.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I think that we definitely see a shift. This is a total global war. You know, it's taking place in Africa, the Mideast, in Asia, in Europe, and I think it does completely change the geographical imagination, but at a moment in time, which, as we see, the business is already imagining this kind of more than the international, a global interconnections. And so I do see that shift. I don't think I think today when we talk about globalization, it's not exactly what was meant back then, but we do see certain resonances. So, absolutely.
Something that has struck me throughout is the emphasis, obviously, on the Northern Hemisphere and the idea of this as potentially global, but obviously very not global in that it's ignoring an entire hemisphere, does anticipate the Cold War incursions into places like Central and South America, in that it is just the bottom half of this globe that's been blown away in Bloom's painting. It is invisible and just open, right, for our own incursions. It is a non-existent, non-national space in the imaginary that you've drawn out here.
A homogenized space. Yeah.
Yeah, and a space that lacks agency.
Yeah. That's good. Thank you.
The maps are wonderful, and some of them have a chart about distortion. Mm-hmm. So the Mercator, the first Mercator one showed how that when you go further north, it becomes more and more distorted in a little pencil, in a little grid.
Yeah.
And one of the versions of the polar map did that too, mm-hmm. but in the other way.
Right.
And those little grids look like, or might be, this is the string grid around the globe in the Fortune magazine cover. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how conscious anyone was. Sometimes the Mercator people are very conscious of the distortion, and then sometimes because they put that grid in,
right.
and sometimes they eliminate it.
Yeah.
And the same for the global one,
right.
which is
That's nice also because we get these grids in Bloom in his scaffolding, but also in the fracture ward. So all of these grids and where they break apart it's a kind of interesting theme to trace through. So thank you.
Let's do one more question. Okay, let's do two questions.
Thank you for this talk. I'm very interested in the context of the production of these images, especially the Thomas Hart Benton invasion and the Abbott Laboratories publication that came out of that. So I wonder if you could speak to the other kinds of images that were in that collection of images, the Year of Peril. And also you place this image in the context of all of these things coming out of Fortune magazine, which I'm going to be speaking a little bit about tomorrow. But I'm curious about the reception of these in that audience versus in the larger American art conversation in this period.
Abbott Laboratories was a pharmaceutical company based in Chicago, still there. And they became very active patrons of the arts, as you may already know, in the 30s and during World War II, sometimes promoting their own, like penicillin, what they're producing. Other times just involved in the war effort. And they produce a lot of pamphlets, a lot of pictures, most of which are now in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Military Museum. And this particular pamphlet by Benton, I could show you the images. I mean, there are three that show plane crashes in the Pacific and mangled bodies. There's one really gory picture of the three fascist figures putting a bayonet into the guts of a Christ on the cross. So it's meant to be very visceral and to create outrage in the viewers. As a matter of fact, the office of the U.S. government decided that though that kind of propaganda probably wasn't going to be effective, and they steered away from it after Benton's pictures and wanted more kind of positive, like the Rosie the Riveter, kind of we're going to fight the war on a positive note. So that picture, even though that pamphlet was widely reproduced and seen in the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, it really didn't generate further imagery of that sort. I don't know if that answered your question, but Oh, and it was not something espoused by Fortune either. So, yeah.
It's maybe a stupid remark, so I'm sorry, maybe. But when I first saw the picture Invasion by Benton, I was struck by a similarity to the Raft of the Medusa by Jericho. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't make sense with the meaning of the picture, but the overall structure of the composition and the way the painting falls into the spectator.
Right. No, I can see what you're saying about that. I do think there's a resonance, and it sort of brings up the issue of, is this really landscape or is it history painting? Kind of.
And also it gives the idea maybe that it is sea behind.
Yeah.
It's a very strange landscape.
Yeah.
Seascape maybe.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely see that. I think that's a good point.
Yeah. I had more a question, because it was very interesting what you said about the exhibition on maps at the MoMA.
Yeah.
And were there pieces of works of art in the exhibition, or only maps?
No, it was all maps and globes, and it was not. There were no artworks. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Thank you so much, Sessile, and thank you, everyone. So if you could join us for a cocktail reception downstairs, that would be wonderful. This building is a little bit confusing, so if you take the elevator or the stairs, you need to come out into the long corridor towards the rotunda, and it's Saal Warburg, or just follow those who know this building. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much for all your comments.